Verid stood at the edge of what was once a valley, now a chasm wide enough to swallow a small continent. The wind howled through was the exact snack Lieutenant Calix was contemplating as he stood knee-deep in grease, staring at what passed for the ship's engineering marvel, a sputtering, groaning piece of tech that looked like it could have been cobbled together by a drunken junk trader. "Well, that's the last time I let you pick lunch," Calix muttered, aiming a glare at his companion, a wiry lad named Grizz with a dubious facial hair arrangement that suggested he had lost a bet with a razor. Grizz shrugged, unperturbed. "Hey, at least it's not moving. Yet, can't say the same for the waste recyclers," Calix grunted. In the grand hierarchy of ship life, they were somewhere between the cockroaches and that weird green slime that occasionally oozed from the ducts. Genetic castes, they called it. Some got to be pilots, some scientists, and some, like Calix, got the glamorous role of wrench monkey. But it was work, and work, even if it involved coaxing life into failing tech, was better than the alternative. Like being spaced for insubordination. Again. "Stop daydreamin', Calix," came a voice from above, dripping with the kind of authority that suggested its owner had once enjoyed a good meal without the accompaniment of engine oil. Sergeant Riker, upper caste officer and perpetual pain in Calix's behind, descended into the pit like a particularly disgruntled deity. "We've got a situation," Calix echoed, wiping his hands on a rag that might have once been white. "What kind? The kind where we pretend to care, or the kind where we actually have to care? The kind where you pull your head out of your ass and get moving," Riker snapped. Calix sighed. "All right, lead the way, oh great one." They trudged through the cramped corridors, dodging a small flock of scurrying technicians who looked like they'd just survived a close encounter with a plasma torch. The air, thick with recycled despair, buzzed with the subtle hum of machinery and the not-so-subtle buzz of Grizz still trying to justify his lunch choices. "Rumor has it," Grizz was saying, "that some folks down in the lower decks have been acting all kinds of weird. Like super weird. Weird, huh? Like the time you thought you could beat a Vork at cards," Calix snorted, a sound halfway between a laugh and a choke. "Hey, that Vork cheated." "Yeah, tell that to your empty credit account." They reached the medical bay, which, thankfully, was less like a slaughterhouse than usual. The ship's doc, a grizzled veteran with a personality as abrasive as asteroid dust, met them at the door. "Lieutenant," Doc said, nodding without enthusiasm, "we got a problem. And here I thought this was a social call," Calix replied. "What's up?" Doc motioned them over to a containment cell where a figure lay twitching under flickering lights. "This one came in last night, babbling about voices, seeing things." Thought he was just drunk until his skin started doing the mambo. Calix peered closer, suppressing a shiver. The man's skin undulated like a bag full of snakes. "What the hell is that?" Doc shrugged. "Beats me, but whatever it is, it ain't staying put." "So it's contagious." "Bingo," Doc said dryly. "And the kicker, it's giving them abilities." Riker leaned forward, his expression shifting from disdainful to intrigued. "Abilities? Yeah, like super strength, speed, but also batshit crazy," Doc replied, scratching his chin. "It's screwing with their heads." "Lovely," Calix muttered. "First the lunch, now this." "Yeah, well," Doc continued, "if this spreads, we're talking about a ship-wide carnival of chaos." Riker folded his arms, the gears in his head visibly cranking away. "If they're getting strong, fast, and insane, that means." "You want to use them," Calix said, cutting him off. "Weaponize them." "You catch on fast, Lieutenant." Calix rolled his eyes. "Right, because nothing screams safety like unleashing rabid, super-strong lunatics in confined quarters." Doc shrugged. "Could be worse. They could be sober." Grizz leaned in, whispering with a conspiratorial air. "You think they are alien parasites or something?" "Aliens?" Calix chuckled darkly. "Didn't you hear? We're the aliens now, but yes, sounds about right." "So what do we do?" Grizz pressed, eyes wide with a mix of dread and excitement. Calix sighed, eyeing the writhing figure. "First, we keep this quiet. Last thing we need is a panic." Riker nodded. "I'll see to that. Then," Calix continued, "we figure out how to contain this before it turns us all into bad sci-fi cliches. And the lunch? Grizz asked. Well, that'll take care of itself, Calix replied with a smirk. Like it always does. Just as they turned to leave, the containment cell's alarms blared and the infected man slammed against the glass, eyes blazing with an unsettling light. I see you, the man hissed, voice a fractured echo. I see all of you, Calix swallowed, feeling a chill creep down his spine. Right, because that's not creepy at all. Let's get out of here before he decides to start quoting nursery rhymes, Grizz suggested, already backing away. As the group hustled back through the corridors, the air felt heavier, like the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Calix couldn't shake the feeling that they were all dancing on the edge of a blade, one wrong step away from a very messy end. You think we'll get out of this one, Lieutenant? Grizz asked, voice barely above a whisper. We always do, Calix replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Just gotta keep our heads and not get eaten by whatever the hell that was. Wouldn't be the worst way to go, Grizz mused. Beats getting spaced. Calix chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. True, but I'd rather avoid both. They reached the bridge where chaos was just another Tuesday. Officers barked orders, the screens flickered with data streams that made sense to someone somewhere, and the captain looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Lieutenant, the captain barked, waving Calix over. What's your take on this mess? Sir, it's a shitstorm, Calix replied candidly, earning a few raised eyebrows. But we might have a way to control it. The captain nodded slowly. And what do we do if it gets out of hand? Pray, Calix suggested, or start running, fast. The captain didn't laugh, which was fair given the circumstances. Instead, he turned to the main screen where a map of the ship flickered with ominous red dots marking the infected zones. We need containment, the captain said. We can't let this spread. Calix nodded, the weight of the task settling over him like an old, familiar cloak. We'll do what we can, sir. As they moved to leave, Grizz shot him a sideways glance. You really think we can contain this? Calix didn't answer immediately. He thought of the man in the cell, of the madness and the whispers, and the unpredictable chaos that followed such outbreaks like a shadow. We'll have to, he said finally, his voice firm, or we're all screwed. In the back of his mind, though, Calix couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that this was just the beginning, and that the real storm was yet to come. And if there was one thing he knew about storms, it was that they were rarely as fun as they looked from a distance. Let's get to work, Calix said, clapping Grizz on the shoulder. We've got a ship to save. And with that they plunged once more into the fray, a ragtag crew of engineers and officers, armed with nothing more than a few tools, a handful of desperate plans, and an overdose of stubborn humanity. As they moved deeper into the heart of the ship, Calix couldn't help but glance back, half expecting the shadows to twist into something monstrous, something alien. But all he saw were the familiar corridors, the dim lights buzzing overhead, and his own reflection in a cracked viewport. Humanity had always thrived in chaos. Maybe this time would be no different. Maybe. But as the alarms blared and the walls seemed to close in, Calix knew one thing for sure. It was going to be one hell of a ride. Calix wiped the sweat from his brow, smearing a streak of grime across his forehead. It was par for the course when your job was more about keeping the Eternus from collapsing into a scrap heap than any grand adventure. He and Grizz trudged through the claustrophobic corridors, dodging pipes that hissed steam like they were auditioning for a horror vid. Why do I have the feeling we're about to become the ship's most expendable parts? Grizz muttered, glancing warily at a particularly aggressive chunk of loose cabling. Because you're finally catching on to ship life, Calix replied, sidestepping a puddle that looked suspiciously alive. Let's face it, Grizz, if this ship had a choice between losing us or a working air scrubber, we'd be spaced faster than you can say budget cuts. Their destination was the lab of Dr. Vera, a high-caste scientist with a mind as sharp as a monomolecular blade and a personality to match. If anyone could make sense of the writhing chaos in the med bay, it'd be her. They reached the lab, where the door slid open with a theatrical hiss, designed to impress someone who wasn't living on a decrepit fortress ship. Inside, the space was cluttered with data pads and holographic displays, chaos in digital form. "Lieutenant Calix," Dr. Vieira said, not looking up from her work. She had the kind of icy demeanor that suggested she knew just how much smarter she was than everyone else and wasn't about to let anyone forget it. "Doc," Calix replied, a slight nod in her direction. "We've got a bit of a situation. The parasite infection, yes," she said, pinching her lips together like she was trying to prevent herself from saying what she really thought about their predicament. "I assume you're not just here for social call. Only if your idea of small talk involves skin-crawling nightmares," Grizz interjected, eyeing a particularly ominous-looking piece of equipment that was humming ominously, or maybe just judging him silently. Dr. Vieira sighed, turning to face them, her eyes sharp behind a pair of sleek optical enhancers. "I've been monitoring the infected." "Fascinating developments, really." "Fascinating isn't the word I'd use," Calix said, crossing his arms. "More like terrifying." "Well, yes," she conceded with a thin smile that did little to warm the room. "But have you considered the implications?" Grizz gave Calix a helpless look, the universal gesture for "I haven't a clue but feel free to improvise." "Implications like what?" Calix asked, raising an eyebrow. "That we're all going to end up as raving lunatics with a side of superpowers." "Possibly," Dr. Vieira said, turning back to her data pads. "The parasites seem to enhance certain physical and cognitive abilities, but at a cost. Their impact on neural pathways is disconcerting." "Disconcerting," Grizz echoed. "Try downright insane." "What about their intelligence?" Calix pressed, leaning over the display. "Riker mentioned something about them being weaponized." "Oh, they're definitely more than mindless parasites," she replied, her voice laced with that familiar superior tone. "There's evidence to suggest they're capable of strategic thought, even communication across hosts." "Great," Calix said with a dry laugh. "We're dealing with a hive mind, just what we needed." Grizz grimaced. "Aren't hive minds supposed to, I don't know, think as one?" "That's the problem," Dr. Vieira said, her expression grave. "They're not. Each host shows signs of individuality as if they are all competing for dominance within the network." "Like a committee," Calix said, rubbing his temples. "A committee of parasites." "That's one way to put it." Dr. Vieira's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "So what's the plan?" Calix asked, glancing at the data pads again. "Can we contain this, or are we just buying time before everything goes to hell?" Dr. Vieira shrugged, an elegant motion that managed to convey both resignation and contempt for their predicament. "There's a chance we can isolate and study them further, perhaps even negotiate if they are intelligent enough." But, Grizz prompted, knowing full well that the word "but" in this context was rarely followed by anything good. "But the caste system doesn't exactly encourage creative solutions," she finished, choosing her words with the care of someone who knew that the wrong turn of phrase could get her demoted to janitorial duties. Calix exchanged a glance with Grizz. "Figures," he muttered. "Here we are on the brink of chaos, and the dam system is what's likely to screw us over." "The higher castes," Dr. Vieira said with a sigh, "are unlikely to see eye to eye with the lower castes on the matter of collaboration. They don't like to get their hands dirty, metaphorically speaking." "And literally," Grizz added, eyeing the grease smudges on his own fingers. "So we're on our own then," Calix stated, scratching his stubbled chin. Again, Dr. Vieira arched an eyebrow. "You're resourceful, Lieutenant. I'm sure you'll think of something." "Yeah, because thinking on my feet in a death trap is basically what I signed up for," Calix said dryly. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, though." Grizz peered at the nearest display, frowning as lines of data streamed past. "So what's stopping us from just blasting these things out an airlock?" Dr. Vieira looked at him like he'd suggested they all take a long walk out of the ship. "Aside from ethical concerns, you mean?" "Wouldn't want to hurt the little darlings," Calix muttered, flexing his fingers as if he could just squeeze the parasites out of the ship with sheer determination. "Besides," Dr. Vieira continued, "we're not sure how they'd react to the vacuum. It could make them more unstable." Unstable parasites, Calix repeated, shaking his head. Just when you think things can't get worse. That's the beauty of life on the Eternus, Grizz said, voice dripping with sarcasm. There's always a new low right around the corner, Calix sighed, feeling the weight of his responsibilities settling like a lead blanket over his shoulders. All right, Doc, keep doing your thing. We'll see what we can do on our end. Best of luck, Lieutenant, Dr. Vieira said, her voice unexpectedly earnest. You're going to need it. That's the understatement of the century, Calix replied, turning to leave. As they walked back through the dimly lit corridors, Grizz shot him a sidelong glance. You really think we can pull this off? Do we have a choice? Calix asked with a shrug. We'll either fix this or we'll go down swinging. Grizz chuckled, though it sounded more like a wheeze. Swinging in a vacuum doesn't sound all that appealing. Beats letting those parasites do the cha-cha in our brains, Calix said, his tone light despite the grim subject. They reached the engineering bay, a maze of tangled wires, half-functioning consoles, and the ever-present smell of burnt circuits. Calix surveyed the mess with a weary sense of familiarity. All right, he said, cracking his knuckles. Let's get to work. If we're gonna save this rusty coffin, we've gotta start somewhere. Grizz nodded, glancing around at the labyrinthine chaos. You sure you're not just looking for an excuse to play with the big wrenches? Calix grinned, though it was more a baring of teeth than anything else. Hell, if we're gonna die, might as well do it with our tools in hand. With that, they plunged into the task at hand, patching together what they could, improvising the rest, and generally making the most of the junkyard of technology they'd been saddled with. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and effort, punctuated by the occasional curse as things refused to cooperate or exploded in their faces. Yet through it all, Calix felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They might have been underdogs in a rigged game, but they weren't about to roll over and die quietly. Hey, Calix, Grizz called over the hum of machinery. You think this whole thing might be some kinda cosmic joke? Like, we're just the punchline? Could be, Calix replied, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. But if we're the joke, I'd like to think we're at least a funny one. Yeah, well, here's hoping the galaxy's got a sense of humor, Grizz said, flashing a tired grin. Calix nodded, setting his jaw with determination. One bad punchline at a time, Grizz, one at a time. As they worked, the ship around them groaned and creaked, a cacophony of metallic protest. Yet despite its faults and frailties, the Eternus was home. And in the end, that meant something worth fighting for, even if it sometimes felt like they were bailing out a sinking ship with nothing but a thimble. Calix paused, glancing around the engineering bay at the haphazard repairs and the challenge of keeping it all together. Despite the darkness closing in around them, there was a spark of hope, a flicker of defiance. All right, he said, standing tall despite the grime and exhaustion. Let's show those parasites what it means to be human. Grizz pumped a fist in the air, his voice a raspy echo. Damn right. With renewed vigor, they dove back into the chaos, the weight of the ship on their shoulders, and the determination to fight against the odds. Whatever lay ahead, they'd face it together, with a wrench in one hand and a dark joke on their lips. The meeting room on the Eternus was about as welcoming as a punch to the face, metallic walls, flickering lights, and a lingering smell of something that should have been disposed of months ago. It was cramped with people, a mix of upper and lower castes, all crammed together like sardines in a tin can, ready to argue their way into oblivion. Sergeant Riker stood at the head of the table like he owned the place, which, technically, was true in the way upper caste folks like to think they owned everything that wasn't nailed down. His crisp uniform made him look like he just stepped out of a recruitment holo, every inch the poster boy for galactic order and superiority. Let's get this over with, Riker said, voice as sharp as a monomolecular blade. We've got a parasite problem that's not going away on its own. Problem. Calix muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with sarcasm. More like a bloody infestation, Doctor. Vieira, seated across from him, gave a small nod, her face impassive. Indeed, Lieutenant. The parasites aren't just a nuisance, they are evolving. Fast, A low murmur spread through the room like a wave of barely contained panic. Riker's expression tightened, and Calix could have sworn he saw the man's eye twitch. The mere thought of parasites that were smarter than half the crew was enough to make anyone lose sleep. Evolving? Riker asked, aiming for skepticism but landing somewhere near outright denial. What does that mean for us? It means, Vera replied, her voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel, we're dealing with something that might be more intelligent than we anticipated. They're reorganizing, possibly communicating, and they seem interested in asserting their presence. A sentient parasite committee, Calix interjected, unable to keep the edge of humor out of his voice. Wonderful. Can they take over Riker's job too? A few stifled laughs echoed around the room, though Riker's glare could have peeled paint. Enough, he snapped. We're not here to joke around. We need a solution, if I may, one of the upper caste scientists said, adjusting his ornate lapel like he was gearing up for a lecture. We should be looking at this as a potential opportunity. Grizz snorted, earning a look that could curdle milk. Opportunity for what? A faster way to lose our minds, integration, the scientist continued undeterred. If these parasites can be controlled, they could enhance our abilities. Or, Calix said, not bothering to hide his disdain, they could just turn us all into drooling husks. Nice trade-off. Vera stepped in, her voice calm but firm. There's still too much we don't know before considering any integration. We need to understand them better. Riker folded his arms, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. And how do you propose we do that? Experiments, Vera replied, her eyes meeting Calix's. Controlled and discreet. Calix caught the unspoken suggestion and nodded slightly. A covert plan, one that wouldn't involve the oversight of the higher-ups who valued their precious hierarchy over practical solutions. Experiments? With what resources? Riker asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. We're already stretched thin. Vera's smile was as thin as a razor's edge. We're resourceful. We'll manage. Riker didn't look convinced, but he knew when he was beaten, if only for the moment. Fine. But keep me updated. I won't have this ship turning into a lab experiment gone wrong. With a dismissive wave, the meeting was adjourned, and Calix and Vera slipped away, their minds already turning over the possibilities and the risks. They reconvened in Vera's lab, a cluttered space that somehow managed to feel more like home than anywhere else on the Eternus. The air was filled with the hum of machinery and the faint glow of holographic displays casting patterns across the walls. So, we're doing this? Calix asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against a console. We are, Vera replied, her eyes scanning over the data pads strewn across her desk. If we can't rely on the upper caste to make the right decision, we'll have to take matters into our own hands. Calix tilted his head, a wry smile playing at his lips. And here I thought you were just a cold-hearted scientist. Vera's lips twitched in a ghost of a smile. I'm full of surprises, Lieutenant. They spent the next few hours gathering what they needed, stealthily requisitioning equipment and supplies from the ship's stores. It was a delicate dance, one that required more than a little creative math in the inventory logs. Meanwhile, the infected individuals on the Eternus were proving to be anything but quiet. Word had spread, like an inconvenient rash, and they were beginning to organize, demanding recognition, rights, and a voice in the decisions affecting their fate. Calix wasn't entirely unsympathetic. Being treated like a cog in the machine was something he understood all too well. But parasites or not, the thought of a bunch of infected folks running amok was enough to make him double-check the locks on his quarters. Think it'll work? Grizz asked as they hunched over a makeshift lab setup they'd commandeered in the bowels of the ship. Not a damn clue, Calix replied, tapping at a data pad. But at this point, any progress is better than none. Grizz watched as Vera expertly extracted a sample from one of the containment cells. You know, this could all blow up in our faces. Literally, wouldn't be the first time, Calix said with a shrug. But hey, if we solve this problem, maybe they'll rename the ship in our honor. The Calix and Grizz has a nice ring to it. Vera looked up from her work, an eyebrow raised. And where do I fit into this grand renaming scheme? Your name's too long, Calyx said, grinning. We'll dedicate a hallway or something. You're all heart, Lieutenant, she replied, turning back to her work with a faint smile. The work was grueling, iors blending into each other with the steady hum of equipment and the occasional hiss of steam pipes reminding them of the Eternus age. But it was the kind of work that kept Calyx's mind sharp, even as fatigue began to claw at the edges of his vision. Hey, Grizz said suddenly, breaking the silence. You ever think about how stupid this all is? Pretty frequently, Calyx replied, adjusting a control knob. What's on your mind? Grizz scratched his chin, leaving a smear of grease behind. We're risking our necks for a ship that's falling apart, dealing with parasites that could turn us into meat puppets, and the only thing we get in return is more work. Yeah, but it's our mess, Calyx said, glancing around the cluttered lab. We've got to clean it up, or else we're gonna end up as part of the debris. Vera looked up, her gaze steady. I knew there was a reason I liked you, Calyx. You have a way of simplifying the impossible. Don't let it go to my head, he said, though a flicker of something warm spread through him at her words. I'm just trying to survive. Survival's as good a reason as any, Vera said, focusing on the sample under the microscope. As they worked, the Eternus continued its journey through the void, a metal behemoth held together with stubbornness and hope. The infected, emboldened by their newly organized status, began pushing for negotiations, turning the ship's corridors into makeshift meeting places where arguments flared like wildfires. Calyx kept his head down, mindful of the tension simmering just below the surface. The ship felt like a powder keg, and he wasn't keen on being around when it blew. Hey, Grizz said one evening as they sat in the engineering bay, their work for the day finally done. You think we'll ever get off this ship? Calyx leaned back, looking up at the ceiling where pipes snaked like metallic veins. If we don't, someone's gonna have to rename the Eternus the Eternal. Because that's how long it feels like we've been stuck here. Grizz chuckled, though there was a weary edge to it. Yeah, but maybe that's the point. Some kind of cosmic joke, right? Could be, Calyx replied, though his tone was more thoughtful than jesting. But I'd like to think we're not the butt of the joke. We're the punchline that comes out on top. That's the spirit, Grizz said, raising an imaginary glass. To making the universe laugh on our terms. Damn right, Calyx said, a grin tugging at his lips. The work continued, the stakes rising with each passing day. The parasites, the infected, the upper castes, and the ship itself, all pieces in a game no one fully understood, yet everyone was forced to play. In a moment of rare calm, Calyx stood at one of the observation windows, looking out at the vast expanse of stars beyond. The universe was indifferent to their plight, vast and uncaring, a reminder that they were all just specks in the cosmic dust. But as long as there was breath in his lungs and a wrench in his hand, he'd keep fighting, because that's what humans did. They survived, they adapted, and they found humor in the darkest of places. Well, universe, Calyx muttered to himself, if you're listening, here's hoping you've got a sense of humor. He turned away from the window, determination hardening in his chest. The battle wasn't over, and the odds were stacked against them. But for Calyx and the crew of the Eternus, giving up was never an option, not when there was still a chance, however slim, to turn the joke back on the universe and laugh in its face. Calyx squinted at the data pad, the screen flickering like it was deciding whether to give up entirely and join the rest of the ship in falling apart. You'd think with all the supposed intelligence on the ship, someone could have invented a decent light bulb. Vera, elbows deep in a tangled mess of wires, and tech that might have been designed by a particularly sadistic gremlin, snorted. We're too busy trying not to get eaten by our science projects, Grizz, sitting against a wall that was alarmingly warm and vibrating in a way that screamed impending explosion, glanced up. Speaking of which, any updates on our friendly neighborhood parasites? Friendly, Calyx muttered, scrolling through pages of gibberish data, about as friendly as a buzzsaw. But yeah, looks like they're spreading faster. They've got some guy named Zerk leading the charge. Charismatic sort, the kind that makes you wanna punch him just to see if he bleeds. Heard he's got half the infected ready to start a revolution, Grizz said with a grimace. As if this ship wasn't a death trap already. Great. A revolution led by the Brain Eaters, Calix said, tossing the data pad onto the cluttered table. Just what we needed. Vera wiped grease off her hands, turning to face them. We've been working on something, though. She gestured toward a jury-rigged contraption that looked half-finished and half-insane. If we can tune it right, we might be able to communicate with them. Calix finished, raising an eyebrow. We talking politely requesting them to stop eating brains or just negotiating a ceasefire, more the latter, Vera said, her expression unchanging. I'm not optimistic about them suddenly finding their conscience. Right, because parasites with morals is exactly what we're missing, Grizz chimed in. Calix leaned back, folding his arms. So we're going to chat with brain parasites. Excellent. What's next? Tea with the Grim Reaper. Let's not give the universe ideas, Vera said, fiddling with a cap that seemed intent on staying loose. But if we can get this working, it might buy us some time. Time's the one thing we don't have a surplus of, Calix said, looking at the mess of wires like it was a particularly unruly pet. And now, Zerk's bunch is running amok, seeing just how far they can push before this ship goes from barely functioning to metal coffin. As if on cue, the lights flickered above them. Calix looked up just in time to see the overhead lamp spit sparks like it was auditioning for a fireworks show. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I swear, this ship's held together by duct tape and spite. Spite's proven remarkably resilient, Vera remarked, her voice dry. But it can't fix everything. Calix was about to respond when the door slammed open, a silhouette standing in the doorway like a harbinger of doom. It was Sergeant Riker, looking as thrilled to be there as a cat in a dog pound. We've got a problem, Riker said, voice gruff enough to sky or rust off a bulkhead. Just one. Calix quipped, but Riker's expression didn't change. The infected are sabotaging ship operations. We've got power fluctuations, life support issues, and they've taken over parts of the lower decks. Calix exchanged a glance with Vera. Zerk's gang, Riker nodded, his jaw clenched. They're demanding rights recognition. They're holding the ship hostage with their antics. Grizz let out a low whistle. So the parasites are going Union. Calix chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Guess we should have seen it coming. Everyone wants a seat at the table, even if they've got worms in their brains. Question is, how long before the table flips and crushes us all? Vera asked, eyes dark with concern. Not long, Riker replied. Which is why I need you to get that contraption of yours working. We need to talk to them before things get worse. Or at least before they turn the ship into Swiss cheese, Grizz added. Calix sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, we'll get this thing up and running. But if it doesn't work and this whole tin can implode, I'm blaming you, Riker. Blame away, Riker said, turning to leave. Just get it done. As the door closed behind him, Calix turned to Vera. Guess we've got our marching orders. Vera nodded, already back at the tangled mess of wires. Let's just hope Zerk's not as stubborn as this damn equipment. The hours passed in a blur of cursing, sweat, and the kind of frantic work that felt more like triage than proper engineering. Calix found himself knee-deep in wires, muttering darkly about the state of the ship and the sheer idiocy of trying to reason with parasites. Grizz sat nearby, occasionally offering tools or unsolicited advice. You know, maybe this Zerk guy's onto something. Maybe the parasites are an upgrade. I mean, we could all do with a little more brain power. Maybe, Calix grumbled, but I draw the line at sharing headspace with a tapeworm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vera stepped back, wiping her hands on her jumpsuit. I think we've got it. Calix straightened up, cracking his neck. You sure know, she replied, a hint of mischief in her eyes. But I'm optimistic, he repeated with a chuckle. That's a new one. They powered up the device, the room filling with a low hum that set Calix's teeth on edge. For a moment, nothing happened, and he was about to voice his doubts when a series of blips and beeps echoed from the machine. Well, that's new, Grizz said, leaning in. Calix watched as Vera adjusted the controls, her focus intense. "Are they responding? Looks like it," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's rudimentary, but there's something there." "Great," Calix said, rolling his eyes. "Now we just have to convince them not to tear the place apart." Easier said than done. As they worked on refining the communication, the ship was in chaos. Reports came in of systems failing, corridors blocked, and Zerk's followers growing bolder by the hour. It wasn't long before they got word of a coup attempt. Zerk and his merry band of brain invaders had taken over the command center. Calix could practically hear the ship groan in response, as if it too was sick of the drama. "We need to move," Vera said, urgency creeping into her voice. Calix nodded, grabbing his tool belt and jamming a wrench into it like a makeshift weapon. "Let's go see if we can't talk some sense into these parasites." The corridors were a riot of flickering lights and steam, the distant rumbles of conflict echoing like a heartbeat. Calix felt like he was walking through a war zone, albeit one where the enemy was inside your head. They made their way to the command center, a fortified area that was now under the control of Zerk and his infected crew. Riker was already there, looking like he'd just bitten into something sour. "Glad you could join us," he said as Calix and Vera approached. "Wouldn't miss it," Calix replied, eyeing the barricades. "What's the plan?" "We try to negotiate," Riker said, though his expression suggested he'd rather be scrubbing engine grease with his toothbrush. "But if that fails, we take it back by force." "Right," Calix said, a humorless smile on his lips. Negotiations with parasites. What could go wrong? With their makeshift device in hand, they approached the barricade, the tension thick enough to cut with a monomolecular blade. Zerk appeared, flanked by his henchmen, his expression smug and self-assured. "Nice of you to join the party," Zerk drawled, a gleam in his eyes that suggested he was enjoying himself far too much. "We're here to talk," Riker said, his voice steady. "Talk," Zerk echoed, a grin spreading across his face. "About what?" "How we're going to run this ship now." Calix stepped forward, holding up the device. "Look, Zerk, we can communicate with the parasites. We're trying to find a solution that doesn't end with everyone dead." Zerk's eyes narrowed, skepticism etched across his features. "You really think that's possible?" "We've got to try," Vera said, her voice calm and measured. "Before things get worse." Zerk considered this, his gaze flicking between the device and Calix. "All right, but we're not going anywhere." "Not until we get what we're owed." "And what's that?" Calix asked, though he could already guess the answer. "A place on this ship," Zerk replied, crossing his arms. "We're tired of being treated like second-class citizens." Calix exchanged a look with Vera. He understood the sentiment, but there was no denying the danger looming over them. "We'll do what we can," Calix said, his voice firm. "But first, let's try not to blow up the ship." Zerk nodded, though wariness lingered in his eyes. "You've got until the end of the day. After that, we'll do what we have to." As they turned away, Calix felt the weight of their task settle on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. They had a chance, a slim one, to avert disaster. "Think we'll pull this off?" Grizz asked, falling into step beside him. Calix shrugged, the corners of his mouth twitching into a sardonic grin. "If not, at least we'll go out with a bang." "Let's hope not," Vera said, though her tone was almost fond. "I'd rather not be a footnote in someone else's history." With renewed purpose, they set to work, hoping against hope that their efforts would be enough to stave off catastrophe. The ship groaned around them, a metal behemoth teetering on the edge of oblivion. But for once, Calix felt a flicker of hope. Because if humanity was anything, it was stubborn. Stubborn enough to laugh in the face of despair and keep fighting, no matter the odds. The corridors of the Eternus were a symphony of chaos. Steam hissed from pipes like angry serpents. Lights flickered with the enthusiasm of a caffeine-deprived intern, and the distant rumble of Zerk's takeover played in the background like a poorly rehearsed opera. Calix had always thought the ship's designers should have added an exit sign that simply read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Calix, Vera, and Grizz hurried down the flickering halls, navigating the mess that was their home. If this ship were a person, it'd be that guy who always cancels plans last minute but still expects you to show up for his surprise birthday party, Calix muttered, dodging a cascade of sparks from above. More like the uncle you only see at funerals, Grizz chimed in, stepping over a tangled mess of wires with the grace of a drunken spider. And right now, we're at its wake. Vera didn't look up from the device. Let's just hope we can stop it from getting buried with us inside. They reached an intersection and Calix halted, glancing left and right. All right, which way to the command center? I'm starting to get the feeling we're just rats in a maze, except there's no cheese at the end, just a pissed-off cat named Zerk. Left, Vera said without hesitation, and try to keep a low profile. We don't need more trouble, Calix snorted. Trouble on this ship. Perish the thought. They took the left corridor and hurried along, but barely had they taken a few steps when a group of Zerk's henchmen appeared, blocking their path. Their grins were the kind that suggested a love for chaos and a severe allergy to soap. Well, well, said the leader, a beefy man with a face like a dropped pie. Look what we have here. The fixer and her pet wrench. Hey now, Calix said, holding up his hands. There's no need for names. We're just trying to get to the command center, are you now? The leader said, his eyes narrowing. And why should we let you through? Calix glanced at Vera, then back to the goons. Because if you don't, I'm going to start a motivational speech. You know, one of those long ones about teamwork and potential. I'm a real sucker for those. The leader wasn't impressed. Motivational speeches, huh? I hate those even more than motivational posters. Then let us through and you won't have to hear one, Calix said, trying for charm and landing somewhere around desperation. We've got bigger fish to fry than you lot. Like, say, not dying. The goons exchanged looks before their leader shrugged. Fine. But if Zerk asks, we never saw you. Deal, Calix said, grateful for small mercies. May your existential dread be ever postponed. They slipped past the henchmen and continued down the corridor, the tension in their shoulders easing only slightly. But as they approached the command center, Calix felt a sinking feeling in his gut, like that time he tried Vera's experimental protein paste and realized too late that it doubled as industrial sealant. As they rounded the final corner, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The command center was a battlefield, with Zerk's followers entrenched behind makeshift barricades, their eyes gleaming with fanaticism. And at the center of it all stood Zerk himself, arms raised like a preacher at a revival, every word dripping with charisma. Our time has come, Zerk bellowed. The era of oppression is over. We will reshape this society not as slaves but as equals. Calix rolled his eyes. He's got a future in politics if this whole parasite revolution doesn't pan out. Vera elbowed him. Less commentary, more action. We need to get that device working. They edged forward trying to look like they belonged, but their luck ran out when Zerk's eyes fell on them. His expression was a mix of surprise and amusement, like a cat that found its favorite toy in the dog's bed. Calix, Zerk said, his voice carrying across the room. You finally decided to join us. Calix forced a grin. Couldn't resist the invitation. You throw one hell of a party, Zerk. Zerk chuckled, but it was a humorless sound. Too bad you're on the wrong guest list. He gestured, and suddenly Calix was surrounded, his arms wrenched behind him. Looks like you're our guest now, Zerk said, eyes glinting with triumph. Calix shot Vera a look, hoping she'd catch the silent message. Keep going, whatever it takes. Hey, if you needed a hostage that badly, you could have just asked. I'm very accommodating. Take him away, Zerk ordered, and Calix was hauled off, leaving Vera and Grizz to continue their desperate mission alone. As Vera watched Calix being dragged away, she felt a pang of helplessness. But she couldn't afford to dwell on it. They were running out of time, and the ship wasn't going to save itself. She turned to Grizz, who looked like someone had just shot his dog. We have to keep moving, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Calix is counting on us. Grizz nodded, and together they slipped through the chaos, edging closer to the command center's control panels. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. Meanwhile, Calix found himself unceremoniously dumped in a storage room, his captors leaving with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this sort of thing before. He sat up, wincing as he rubbed his sore wrists. Well, This is cozy. The room was cramped, filled with crates and dust, with a single flickering light bulb providing the ambience of a haunted house. Calix leaned back against a crate, taking stock of his situation. Captured by brain-invaded rebels on a ship one bad day away from imploding. Just another Tuesday. He listened to the distant sounds of the ship, the groans and creaks like a symphony of despair. You had to give it to the Eternus. It was determined to go out screaming. Outside the storage room, Zerk and his followers continued their occupation. Calix could hear Zerk's voice, rallying his people, spinning words like a spider spins webs. It would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. "All right, Calix," he muttered to himself, glancing around the room. "Think. What would Veira do? Probably build a device out of spare parts and escape with a flourish." But since Calix's engineering skills were more duct tape and prayers, he settled for examining his surroundings. Maybe there was something useful here, preferably a big red button labeled "Do Not Press." Back at the command center, Veira and Grizz had reached the control panels. The room was a mess of wires and screens, half of them displaying error messages so dire they might as well have read your screwed. "All right, let's do this," Veira said, setting the device down and beginning the process of interfacing it with the ship's systems. Her fingers flew over the controls, her brow furrowed with concentration. Grizz hovered nearby, keeping watch for any unwanted attention. "Think this'll work?" he asked, his voice low. Veira didn't look up. "It has to. If we can stabilize the systems, maybe we can buy enough time to negotiate with Zerk. And if we can't," Veira paused, her eyes meeting Grizz's. "Then we hope the ship's insurance policy includes death by revolution." Grizz snorted. "Somehow I doubt that." Veira returned to her work, the device humming softly as she made the necessary connections. All around them, the ship seemed to hold its breath, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. In the storage room, Calix had managed to pry open a crate, revealing a collection of outdated tech that looked like it had been salvaged from a museum's reject pile. He picked up a rusty spanner, weighing it in his hand. Not exactly a monomolecular blade, but it'd have to do. "What's the worst that could happen?" he mused. "Oh right, I'm already living it." He set to work, trying to rig something, anything, that might help. It was a long shot, but if there was one thing Calix had learned, it was that desperation made for surprisingly effective motivation. Time slipped by, the ship's creaks and groans a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Veira's fingers danced over the controls, her focus unyielding. Finally, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I think I've got it," she said, glancing at Grizz. "Systems are stabilizing. For now, anyway." Grizz allowed himself a brief smile. "Nice going, Doc." "Now what?" "Now we try and talk some sense into Zerk," Veira said, packing up the device and scanning the room. "Before he decides to play king of the ashes." They navigated back through the chaos, trying to avoid the attention of Zerk's followers. It was like tiptoeing through a minefield, every step threatening to blow up in their faces. Back in his makeshift prison, Calix had managed to cobble together a rudimentary transmitter from the junk he'd found. It was unreliable and about as stable as Grizz after a few too many, but it was better than nothing. "All right, let's see if this jalopy can get through," he muttered, flipping the switch and hoping for the best. Static filled the air, a cacophony of noise that slowly resolved into something recognizable. Calix grinned, momentarily triumphant. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. "Come on, Veira," he whispered. "Pick up." The ship continued its slow dance with disaster, each creak and groan a testament to its impending doom. But amidst the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope, a stubborn refusal to go quietly into the void. Because if there was one thing the crew of the Eternus knew, it was how to keep fighting, even when the universe itself seemed determined to snuff them out. And as long as they drew breath, they'd keep laughing in the face of despair. Because in the darkest of hours, sometimes humor was the only light left. The comforting hum of the ship, which usually sounded like a dying cat, was now eerily absent as Calix sat in his makeshift prison, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that he was the main course at an interstellar buffet. He was just about ready to give the rusty spanner in his hand a promotion to potential escape tool when the door hissed open, revealing Zerk's looming silhouette. "Ah, Calix, enjoying your stay." Zerk's smirk was as wide as a black hole, pulling everything towards its inevitable doom. "Delighted," Calix replied, leaning back against a crate. "Service could use some work, though. No complimentary brain snacks for the guests." Zerk chuckled, stepping into the room with the confidence of someone who just found out they inherited a small moon. "I thought you'd appreciate some quiet time to reflect. You see, things are changing around here." "Oh, I noticed," Calix said with a sardonic tilt of his head. "The ambience has definitely shifted from struggling freighter to hostile takeover." "Indeed," Zerk said, his eyes gleaming like the inside of a plasma reactor. "We've discovered that some of the infected among us have unique abilities. They can influence the parasite's actions, enhance their capabilities." Calix raised an eyebrow, feigning interest while mentally cataloging every rusty tool within reach. "Fantastic. So, you're saying I should prepare for the parasite's talent show next?" "Think of it more as evolution," Zerk said, ignoring the sarcasm. "The next step in our species' development." Calix snorted. "And here I thought the next step involved not getting eaten by your brain buddies." Zerk's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack in the mask. "You underestimate what we're building here, Calix. A new order, free from the shackles of genetic castes." "Sure, because nothing says freedom like mandatory parasite implants," Calix muttered. Zerk's eyes narrowed, but he seemed to decide Calix wasn't worth the effort. "Enjoy your evening, Lieutenant. Your contribution to our cause is appreciated." With that, he turned and left, the door sliding shut with a finality that echoed around the cramped room. Calix waited a beat, then exhaled, shaking his head. "Evolution, my ass." He returned to his cobbling, knowing full well that the odds were stacked higher than a politician's promises. Meanwhile, back in the command center, Vera and Grizz were attempting to navigate through the chaos like it was the world's deadliest obstacle course. Vera had her eyes glued to the device in her hands, ignoring the background noise of impending doom. "Okay, so we stabilized the systems, check," Grizz said, counting off on his fingers. "We try to talk sense into Zerk, check, and now, we what?" "Throw a parade." Vera shook her head, her focus unyielding. "We found a way to amplify human brainwaves. If we can connect with the parasites, we might be able to negotiate directly." "Negotiate? With parasites?" Grizz looked at her like she'd suggested a tea party with rabid wolves. "I mean, sure, why not? Can't be any worse than talking to Sergeant Riker before coffee." Vera allowed herself a small smile. "It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. The device should be able to create a temporary link, give us a chance to communicate. Assuming they don't eat our brains first," Grizz added helpfully. "Always the optimist," Vera murmured, adjusting the settings on the device. "But if Calix can hold out, we might just pull this off." Grizz nodded, his expression serious for once. "Let's just hope he doesn't decide to join the other team." Vera paused, considering the possibility. "Calix, nah, he's too stubborn to go down without a fight." With that, they continued their work, the ship around them a maelstrom of chaos and uncertainty. It was a race against time, the Eternus creaking under the weight of rebellion and desperation. In the storage room, Calix marveled at the sheer audacity of his plan. He'd managed to cobble together something resembling a transmitter, though it looked more like a toddler's attempt at building a spaceship out of soup cans. Still, it might just be enough to get a signal out. "All right, you hunk of junk," he muttered, flipping the makeshift switch. "Do your thing." Static filled the air, the familiar crackle of a connection sputtering to life. Calix grinned, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. "Come on, Vera, pick up." It was a long shot, but then again, so was everything else they'd done since Zerk had decided to play God. As the ship continued its slow dance with destruction, Vera's device began to hum with barely contained power. With any luck, it would bridge the gap between human and parasite, creating a channel through which they could talk, or at least reach a mutual understanding that didn't involve feasting on brains. "We're ready to give it a shot," Vera said, glancing at Grizz. "You sure you're up for this?" Grizz nodded, though his expression suggested he was reconsidering his life choices. "I guess if we're gonna die, might as well go out with a bang, or a really awkward conversation." Vera activated the device, feeling the hum resonate through her bones. It was like standing next to a live wire, every nerve tingling with anticipation. "Let's see if we can raise Calyx. If anyone can talk sense into him, it's us," Grizz snorted. "Or at least convince him not to get himself killed before we do." In the storage room, Calyx waited, each second feeling like an eternity. Just when he was about to give up, the static resolved into something familiar, a voice. "Calyx, you hear me?" Vera's voice crackled through the makeshift transmitter. Calyx nearly dropped the spanner in surprise. "Vera." "Thank the stars, I was starting to think you'd all decided to pack up and leave me behind." "Tempting," Vera replied, her voice tinged with relief. "But we've got a plan. How's your end holding up?" "Like a house of cards in a hurricane," Calyx said, glancing at the door. "Zerk's got this crazy idea about evolving the species with parasite power-ups." "Yeah, we know," Vera said. "But we think we can talk to them, make them see reason. We've got a device that might let us communicate directly." Calyx raised an eyebrow, half impressed, half terrified. "I'm either going to kiss you or kill you for this plan, probably both." "Fair enough," Vera said with a chuckle. "But first we need you out of there. Can you make a break for it?" Calyx considered the room, the rusty tools, the flimsy door. "I can try, and if I don't make it, tell Grizz he still owes me 50 credits. "Deal," Vera said, the line crackling with static. "Good luck, Calyx." With that, Calyx cut the connection, steeling himself for what was to come. He'd survived this long on sheer stubbornness and the occasional stroke of luck. Surely he could manage an escape from a storage closet. He stood, spanner in hand, eyeing the door like it was a particularly obstinate opponent in a boxing ring. "All right, let's see if those brain enhancements come with a refund policy." Outside, the Eternus groaned as though it were reluctantly waking from a long and troubled sleep. Calyx could hear the distant echoes of Zerk's grandstanding, the words as hollow as his promises of equality. "Time to make my exit," Calyx muttered, stepping forward with determination. Or what passed for determination when you were armed with nothing more than a rusty spanner and a grudge the size of a small moon? He approached the door, fingers crossed, hoping that whatever loyalty remained among the crew would hold long enough for him to make a break for it. The ship wasn't just falling apart, it was actively trying to kill them all, and time was running out. Calyx took a deep breath, then twisted the spanner into the gap between the door and its frame. It was a long shot, but so was everything else in this ridiculous adventure. The metal groaned in protest, but slowly the door began to give. "Come on, you stubborn piece of scrap," he grunted, muscles straining. "If I can get through this, I promise I'll never complain about maintenance duty again." Finally, with a final wrench of effort, the door slid open, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. Calyx stepped out, his heart pounding with adrenaline and defiance. "Now, where were we?" he muttered to himself, scanning the corridor for potential threats. "Ah, yes, saving the ship, talking to parasites, and not getting killed." Another day in paradise. He took a deep breath and headed down the corridor, moving with the grace of someone who knew every inch of the Eternus like the back of his hand. He just hoped his luck would hold long enough to see it through. Meanwhile, Vera and Grizz were preparing for their next move. The command center was a beehive of activity, wires and screens buzzing with information. The tension was palpable, but so was the determination, a stubborn refusal to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. "Calyx is on his way," Vera said, her eyes on the device. "If we can establish a link, we might just be able to get through to them." Grizz nodded, his usual humor replaced by a grim resolve. "And if not, then we improvise," Vera replied. "But I refuse to let Zerk's insanity win." "Not without a fight." The ship shuddered as though in agreement, the creaks and groans a testament to its age and weariness. Vera adjusted the settings on the device, feeling the hum of potential energy coursing through her. "Let's do this," she said, determination etched into every line of her face. "For Calix, for the crew, for everyone who still believes in something better." Grizz grunted in agreement, his fingers brushing the controls. Let's hope the parasites are in a listening mood. As they prepared to make contact, the Eternus continued its slow, inevitable march towards destruction. But amidst the chaos, there was a flicker of hope, a stubborn, defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. Because in the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that, even in the darkest of times, humanity could still rise above and fight back against the darkness. Calix sprinted down the dimly lit corridor of the Eternus like a rat trying to escape a sinking ship, and with the same sense of panicked urgency. The ship was in worse shape than a politician's morals, with steam hissing and lights flickering like they were auditioning for a horror flick. Not that Calix had time to worry about atmosphere when there were more immediate concerns, like avoiding getting his brain slurped out by a parasite. He skidded around a corner, nearly colliding with an exposed pipe. "Great, another death trap," he muttered, sidestepping the obstacle. "If the parasites don't get me, the ship surely will." His mind was a chaotic mess, not unlike the ship itself. There was Veyra's crazy plan to communicate with the parasites, his desperate escape from the storage room, and the nagging sensation that at some point in his life he must have really pissed off the cosmic forces. Otherwise, why the hell was he here? Meanwhile, Veyra was hunched over her jury-rigged contraption, her fingers dancing over the controls with a mixture of precision and desperation. Grizz hovered nearby, a reluctant partner in this mad science experiment. "You think this thing will work?" Grizz asked, eyeing the device as if it might explode, and given its cobbled-together nature, that was a distinct possibility. "No idea," Veyra replied, her voice tight with focus. "But if it doesn't, we're fresh out of ideas, unless you've got a magic wand hidden somewhere." Grizz snorted, his trademark humor making a rare appearance. "Sorry, left my armory of magical artifacts in my other pants." Veyra allowed herself a brief smile, the levity a welcome distraction from the looming doom. "Right. Well, here's hoping we don't end up in the official handbook for how not to negotiate with aliens." The device hummed with potential energy, like a beast waiting to be unleashed. Veyra took a deep breath and flipped the final switch, sending a pulse of brainwaves through the ship like a telepathic SOS. "Okay, let's see if they're picking up what we're putting down," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. In another part of the ship, Calix felt a strange sensation wash over him, like someone had just turned up the volume on a forgotten part of his brain. Instinctively, he knew it was Veyra's doing, her device sending out a call to the parasites. Now if only the parasites were willing to listen. The corridor stretched out before him, an endless maze of shadows and threats. He kept moving, adrenaline and fear propelling him forward. He was close, he could feel it. Now all he had to do was not die before he reached Veyra and Grizz. The ship groaned ominously, as if sensing the tension within. Calix grimaced, teeth clenched as he pushed on. "Come on, old girl, hold it together," he muttered. "I've got a date with destiny and I'd rather not show up late." As he rounded the final bend, Calix spotted the entrance to the command center. Relief washed over him, though he knew better than to assume the hard part was over. Not when Zerk was still on his power trip, and the parasites were one bad mood away from devouring everyone. He burst through the doors, panting like a dog after a chase. Veyra and Grizz looked up, their expressions a mixture of surprise and relief. "Calix, you made it," Veyra exclaimed, her voice tinged with genuine warmth. "Yeah, and I didn't even have to sell my soul," Calix replied, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. "So what's the plan, besides not dying, of course?" Veyra gestured to the device, which was humming with energy. "We've sent out a signal. If the parasites are willing to talk, we might have a shot at convincing them to ditch Zerk's plan. Assuming they even care what we have to say," Grizz added, his skepticism palpable. "Hey, we're nothing if not the galaxy's most persistent pests," Calix shot back. If anyone can sell this idea, it's us. As if on cue, the device crackled to life, the air around them vibrating with a strange, otherworldly energy. It was like standing at the edge of a thunderstorm, the potential for chaos crackling in the air. Vera's gaze was intense, her fingers deftly adjusting the controls. Here goes nothing. Let's see if we can make a deal. The energy pulsed through the room, a silent call reaching out across the ship. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the machinery and the collective breath of those present. Then, a voice. No, more like a chorus of voices blending into a single entity. It was alien and unnerving, yet there was an intelligence behind it that was impossible to deny. "We hear you," the voice intoned, resonating through the room like a ghostly echo. Calix felt a shiver run down his spine. Well, that's either really good or really bad. Hard to tell with these things. Vera stepped forward, her expression a mix of determination and caution. "We want to talk. We think there's more to gain from cooperation than conflict." There was a pause, the silence heavy with anticipation. Then the voice responded, a ripple of curiosity threading through its tone. "What do you propose, humans?" Riz shot Calix a look, eyebrows raised. "See, told you they'd be curious." Everyone loves a good negotiation. Calix rolled his eyes but couldn't help the grin tugging at his lips. "Yeah, well, let's just hope they've got a soft spot for hard luck stories." Vera took a deep breath, her voice steady as she continued. "Zerk's plan will lead to destruction for both our species, but together we could find a way to coexist. The parasites have unique abilities and humans have resources. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." The voices murmured amongst themselves, a strange, melodic sound like wind through a forest of metal. Finally, they spoke again, their tone considering. "Your logic is intriguing, human, but what guarantee do we have of your sincerity?" Calix stepped forward, his own voice firm. "We're willing to prove it. Help us stop Zerk and we'll work together to create a new order, one where both our species thrive." There was another pause, the tension thick enough to cut with a monomolecular blade. Then finally, the voices spoke once more, their tone softened by a hint of agreement. "We accept your terms, humans. We will aid you against Zerk. But know this, betrayal will not be tolerated." "Fair enough," Vera replied, relief washing over her features. "We're all in this together now." The energy in the room seemed to shift, settling into a more cooperative rhythm. Calix let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a sense of cautious hope blooming within him. "Well, that was easier than expected," Grizz remarked, crossing his arms. "Maybe we should try negotiating our way out of bad situations more often." "You mean instead of running headfirst into danger like we usually do?" Calix replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Grizz shrugged. "Hey, it's a thought." With their tentative alliance secured, the trio turned their attention to the next step, confronting Zerk and his faction. The ship was still a powder keg waiting to blow, but at least now they had a chance to defuse it. Vera adjusted the device, ensuring the connection remained stable. "We need to move quickly. Zerk won't sit idle if he gets wind of this." "Agreed," Calix said, running a hand through his hair. "Let's end this before things get any uglier." The three of them set off, their path illuminated by the flickering lights and the strange, newfound hope pulsing through the ship. It was time to confront Zerk, stop his mad plans and maybe, just maybe, save the future of both species. As they moved through the corridors, Calix couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie with the ship itself. The Eternus was battered and bruised, but still fighting, still holding together despite everything. Kind of like him, really. The final confrontation loomed ahead, a culmination of chaos and determination. But for the first time in a long while, Calix felt something other than dread or resignation. He felt possibility. In the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about rising above the odds, about proving that even in the darkest moments, humanity and its allies could find a way forward. And if that meant making friends with brain-eating parasites, well, then so be it. The Eternus creaked like an old man's knees, Right on cue, as Calix, Vera, and Grizz made their way to what was left of the command center. The parasites had shifted from an existential threat to squabbling negotiating partners, which was about as reassuring as a peace treaty with a particularly hungry lion. So, what now? Grizz asked, scratching his head with the kind of bewilderment that was usually reserved for tax forms and interspecies politics. Now, Calix shot back, a wry smile playing on his lips. We hope for the best and prepare for the worst. You know, standard operating procedure since this whole mess began. Vera was fiddling with the device, her eyes flicking over the readouts like a gambler checking odds at a rigged casino. We need to stabilize the ship systems first. Get the life support running at more than good luck. You're on your own levels. Calix nodded. Nothing says thank you for not eating us like breathable air and gravity that doesn't randomly give you a face-to-face meeting with the ceiling. The corridors of the Eternus were like a deranged labyrinth built by someone who thought OSHA was a suggestion rather than a guideline. Steam hissed from broken pipes, and the lights flickered with the enthusiasm of a reluctant party-goer. Betzerk didn't think his grand plan of galactic domination would be derailed by a bunch of talking bugs, Grizz remarked, casually avoiding a dangling wire that looked suspiciously like it wanted to introduce itself to his jugular. Sometimes the universe just loves irony, Calix replied. And hey, it's nice to know we weren't the only ones living in a mess. The parasites had their own internal drama to deal with. Vera paused, her fingers tapping out a rhythm only she could hear. Once the systems are stable, we get everyone together. We've got a new world to build, one without Zerk's nonsense. Easier said than done, Calix muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But then again, nothing worth doing is ever easy. Or so they tell me. The command center was a vision of chaos, with consoles spewing data like an overcaffeinated news anchor. The parasites' influence had faded, leaving behind a ghostly residue of their presence. It was like trying to clean up after a particularly lively party, minus the hangover. So this is what peace looks like, Grizz said, surveying the mess. I gotta say, I was expecting more doves and rainbows. Peace is messy, Vera replied. And in our line of work, it usually involves fewer explosions. Speaking of explosions, Calix said, gesturing toward a console that was sparking ominously, we should probably do something about that before it decides to become an impromptu fireworks display. As they worked to stabilize the systems, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. The caste system that had defined their lives was in flux, a relic of a bygone era that was being dismantled one piece at a time. Calix glanced at Vera, her focus unwavering as she worked. Think we can actually pull this off? A new society where we're not just cogs in someone else's machine. Vera met his gaze, her eyes holding a mix of determination and hope. We don't really have a choice, do we? We've got a chance to change things, to make them better, and we'd be fools not to take it. Grizz snorted, his usual humor tinged with something deeper. I'm not used to all this optimism. It's unsettling. But then again, maybe I'm just a sucker for a good underdog story. Aren't we all? Calix replied, a hint of a grin on his face. It's what keeps us going when everything else falls apart. With the systems humming back to life and the ship's death throes momentarily appeased, they turned their attention to the task of integrating the parasites' abilities into their society. It was a delicate balance, like juggling chainsaws while blindfolded. So, how do we sell this to the rest of the crew? Grizz asked, leaning against a console as if daring it to misbehave. Carefully, Vera said, her voice steady. We start with what's in it for them. New abilities, new opportunities. A chance to do more than just survive. Calix nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. We show them what's possible. We lead by example. And if that doesn't work, we bribe them with chocolate and promises of shorter shifts. The ship finally seemed to have settled into some semblance of normalcy, or whatever passed for normal on a half-crippled fortress floating through the void. The lights were still flickering, but now it felt more like mood lighting than a threat of imminent blackout. As they gathered the crew, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. People were wary, yes, but they were also curious, eager to see what this new world might look like. Vera took the lead, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. We've been given a chance here, an opportunity to forge a new path, one that's not defined by where we come from but by where we're going. There was a ripple of agreement, a murmur of assent. It wasn't exactly a standing ovation, but it was a start. And in their line of work, a start was often the best you could hope for. Think they'll go for it? Grizz asked, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crew. They'll go for it, Calix replied, confidence in his voice. Because deep down, everyone loves a good comeback story. And we're about to write one hell of a chapter. With the crew on board and the parasites as unlikely allies, they set about the task of rebuilding. It was slow going, but there was a determination in the air, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. As the days turned into weeks, the changes began to take shape. The caste system, once as rigid as the hull of the ship, was dissolving, replaced by a more fluid hierarchy that valued skills over lineage. Calix found himself in a leadership role, something he'd never expected and wasn't entirely sure he wanted. But there was something gratifying about being part of something bigger than himself, about contributing to a future that was being written one decision at a time. Vera was in her element, her mind a whirl of ideas and innovations. The parasite's abilities were being integrated into their technology, creating possibilities that had been unthinkable just weeks before. Grizz, for his part, was thriving in the chaos. He had a way of making people laugh, of keeping the mood light even when the work was hard and the future uncertain. Together, they were building something new, something better. It wasn't perfect, and there were plenty of missteps along the way. But they were learning, adapting, growing. And as Calix looked out at the expanse of stars beyond the ship, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in a long time. The universe was vast and unpredictable, but it was also full of possibilities. Think we'll make it? Grizz asked, joining Calix at the viewport. We've got as good a chance as anyone, Calix replied, a grin tugging at his lips. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come out of this better than we went in. Grizz nodded, a rare moment of sincerity in his eyes. Here's to the future, whatever it holds. Calix raised an imaginary glass, his mind already racing with ideas and possibilities. To the future, and to proving that humanity's got more fight in it than anyone gave us credit for. Vera joined them, her smile a beacon in the dim light. To the future, she echoed, her voice full of promise. Together they stood at the edge of the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. They were battered, bruised, but unbroken. And for the first time in a long while they were looking forward, not back. Because in the end, it wasn't about where they'd been. It was about where they were going, and the realization that the journey was just as important as the destination. They were survivors, dreamers, builders, and they were ready to make their mark on the universe, one small step at a time. With a final glance at the stars, Calix turned back to the others, a grin on his face and hope in his heart. Let's get to work. 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 work, 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 work,